Hi there, I'm Will Leach.
And I'm Kerry Gregg. Welcome to the Commission Files, coming to you from Studio 2 at the Commission Broadcast Centre.
Episode 6, Kerry. Who'd have thought it? You know, a friend said to me after our first episode of the Commission Files, right, well, you've done that now, you've had your wee podcast, what next? And do you know what was next?
What?
Episode 2 and episodes 3, 4, 5 and 6.
Oh, well... Do you know what? It has actually just been really wonderful, and I've certainly enjoyed meeting all the different guests and finding out about all their different stories too. And 2024 lies before us. We're really glad to have you listening, and you're going to like this one. We're travelling without leaving Studio 2 at all.
Yeah, we're off to the rest of Europe this time, and kind of not.
Our guest spends half his time travelling and the other half of his time living on the shores of Strangford Lough. Someone's very, very fortunate there.
Yeah.
He looks after students all across Europe.
Friends know him as Monty. He's David Montgomery, the Regional Secretary for Europe for IFES.
Tell them who IFES are.
The International Fellowship of Evangelical Students, or to put it another way, all the CUs, the Christian unions across Europe. And that's a big, big area. Here's Monty explaining just how big.
I have the responsibility for all the student ministry work in the universities of Europe. So that takes me from Greenland in the west to the Baltic states in the east, from Norway in the north down to Cyprus in the south.
Monty's also an ordained minister, and for people who like this kind of thing, a Man City supporter. And you know what that makes him, Kerry?
What?
These days, just a bit too smug.
Football. Give me rugby any day. Well, we were delighted to get some time with Monty. This interview has been a while in the planning. The first bit, inviting him to come and join us, was easy. He jumped at the chance.
I bet it really was easy. I ran into him at a friend's daughter's wedding. I tried that old chat-up line, you know, the one everyone does nowadays. Hi, how are you doing? Would you like to be in my podcast?
What am I going to do with you, Will? The thing is, the harder bit was getting him in Ireland and with a bit of time to devote to us. That's taken a few months.
And then there's Factor X. Now, with Monty, there's always a Factor X. When he travels, stuff just kind of happens to him. And stuff just kind of happened on the day we all met, but it really didn't matter. It was worth the wait.
It certainly was. So we settled into Studio 2 here and asked Monty what IFES actually is and what he actually does.
The way I like to put it is that if you were ever part, or if your relatives were ever part of a Christian union in a university, that's a little bit like playing for Glentoran. But those university Christian unions are linked to Christian unions in universities all over Ireland. So it's a little bit like the IFA, you know, Christian Unions Ireland, where I worked for 5 years as their General Secretary, is an umbrella for all of the Christian unions in Ireland. And then those Irish CUs are linked through IFES to other CUs all over Europe and all over the world. So that's a little bit like UEFA or FIFA for football fans. Now, I hope that's where the analogy ends, because although we are in over 170 countries, a little bit like FIFA, I'd like to think we're possibly ethically a little bit different, shall we say. But
I really, really hope so.
Yes.
Considering I don't like football, then.
Well, essentially, if you're in a local CU, and for many that's maybe where their experience finishes, but there is an enormous enrichment in being able to participate in some things that are happening at a national level or a regional or even a global level. This year we had our global IFES World Assembly, so 170 countries represented, about 10 from Ireland were there. So I work for that umbrella body, the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students. And we have 11 regions covering the Americas, Africa, Europe, Eurasia, Asia, South Pacific. And I have the responsibility for all the student ministry work in the universities of Europe. So that takes me from Greenland in the west to the Baltic states in the east, from Norway in the north down to Cyprus in the south. So it was 43, but we have just got Ukraine since the war started. They're part of Eurasia, but for obvious reasons. We have pastoral response, 43 countries, but with pastoral responsibility at the minute for both Ukraine and Israel. So I'll just leave that hanging there, that we have a number of crises in our region at the moment.
Is that a lot of students potentially in third level education of some kind?
Oh, yeah, yes. Well, I don't have the exact numbers of how many are in third level education in Europe totally, but in terms of those who are part of our campus groups, we're sort of in the tens of thousands. We're not the biggest in terms of student numbers. That would clearly be English-speaking Africa, because we've got Nigeria, Ghana, Ethiopia, Kenya, and those national movements could have 60 or 70,000 in them alone. So our biggest number of students come from English-speaking Africa, but we have the biggest number of movements, and that kind of have its own challenges. Because of Europe being the way it is, you know, we have sometimes 20 countries that is a smaller geographical area than a couple of African or American countries. So we have the biggest number of movements, and that brings its own challenges because each of them needs their own separate attention and cultural context, etc.
That's an incredibly diverse region, which means that everything in a lot of ways has to be averaged out whilst also being tailored to individual needs.
Absolutely. One of the big things is language, because with those 44 movements, you're dealing with over 40 languages. And we operate in English, which is just a logistical necessity. But it does mean that in some of our countries, it means that those who are in leadership there, the choice is narrowed a little bit because proficiency in English is really essential.
What does it look like to a student?
Well, essentially it is the Christian Union Society in your university. So we are a bottom-up rather than a top-down organisation. So many mission societies and others have their headquarters, they have their values, they employ staff, and those staff then go and, you know, spread that to the grassroots, if you like. We are a fellowship of autonomous national movements. So we have no say in how Ireland or the UK or Sweden or Denmark organise themselves. What does unite us is our doctrinal basis. So we are a confessional group, and that doctrinal basis is something which most evangelical missionary societies would have, and it keeps us together. It stops denominationalism, it stops territorialism. It allows us to get together with Bible-believing Christians in all sorts of denominations together. So that's one of our values, and therefore if a local group or a movement wanted to move away from that and become very separatist, then we would come in and say, well, if you're affiliated to us, you know, you need to reflect our values. So we're a bottom-up movement in that Ireland and UK and all can organise themselves as they wish. Queen's Christian Union, University of Ulster, Trinity College Dublin will have their own culture, they'll have their own way of doing things suitable to their culture. But the one thing that will remain constant is our strapline, if you like, which is students reaching students with the gospel. We are student-led as well, in that the staff that we employ are facilitators, they are trainers, they're mentors. But what actually happens in the Christian Union is done by the students, largely because increasingly, certainly in Western Europe and secular Europe, you know, outsiders can't come in and organise things for students. Student societies are run by students. Mm-hmm. So what does it look like? It looks like a bunch of students on Freshers' Week or whatever putting a stall up and saying, we're the Christian Union. And either you will find other Christians coming, maybe a little bit nervous about going to university, finding good fellowship there. But you'll also, I suppose more importantly for us, get some inquirers and seekers coming and saying, well, how can you guys still believe that in this day and age? And it's the beginning of some amazing conversations. And we always encourage our local student groups to be outward looking and always to be sure that what they're doing, what they're organising, it's never just this holy huddle for Christians. It's got to be outward looking. We've had a wonderful situation recently in the UK where during COVID they started these things called impact groups, which were specifically for those who wouldn't normally join a Christian group. But they were run by the Christian students. And they were both encouragement for them and also open doors for those who were inquiring or seeking to come in part and to discuss some of the big issues.
That sounds as if it's very much bringing the student world into line with modern day thinking. I'm thinking back to, and well, you and I will think back to years ago whenever we were students.
300 or 400 years
Yeah.
back, yes.
And certainly I have some many happy memories of going down to Irish Conference. So are those the similar sort of things that are happening nowadays?
Those things are still happening. In fact, all our movements would often have their own national conferences. So in the next year, I'll be speaking at the Romanian one, the German one, the Italian one, the Austrian one. And I also have memories, I studied in Scotland, but of those national conferences, which was maybe the one time a lot of students had the chance to interact with Christian students from other parts of the country.
Inevitably, society has moved on, and the world that those students are studying in and learning in and living in is a little different. The pressures, the temptations, the difficulties, the way they enact with their fellow students, with their university. What have you noticed that's the snapshot now that may contrast with the past?
I mean, there has been some research done just about what the new Europe is looking like and all of that, and I think some of that has still to be proven. I mean, we can do best guesses at how things are going,
Yeah.
But it was interesting that our World Assembly, as I said, 170 countries, 1,000 students and staff. For the evenings, the subjects that were chosen for us to look at were how we deal with mental health among students, the environment, the use of the arts, which was hinting at, I think, a fragility among a lot of students. And I think the reasons for that are manifold. I mean, you could look back to the pandemic, but even further back into perhaps a more insecure job market beyond that, to issues of the family environment that many students are coming from, and that could either be because of economic or social difficulties in those families, or immense pressure to succeed and immense pressure to become the doctor or lawyer that mummy or daddy wants you to be. And I have to say, Christian parents are no less prone to that. I used to smile because I would be aware of some colleagues and friends who would run accommodation for Christian students in various cities here, but also in Europe. And they would say the biggest difficulty they have is dealing with parents who want their children in that Christian accommodation, thinking that will protect them against the big bad world that is out there, and if they don't get into that accommodation they will lose their faith. And we smile at this while trying to empathise with the natural desires of those parents. Of course, our antidote to that is saying that what we try to prepare our students for is not a sort of inoculation from the world, but to encourage them to be brave and courageous and to speak God's truth into the public square of the university. And that to do that, they need to be out there and in there. But we are finding more and more students reticent for that. I think there is that fragility. And therefore, sometimes we do have more of a pastoral role than perhaps we had in the past. And even maybe that we would, more than we would like to have, because in the past we maybe rather simplistically delineated, this is our role, this is the church's role. So, we do the evangelism training, we encourage them on how to handle the scriptures in a university context, etc. But, we hope that their pastor, etc., will be able to deal with any pastoral issues. Well, we're finding students maybe coming, maybe they came to faith at a summer camp the previous summer. Or, they don't have a Christian family background, they don't have a church background. And we always encourage our students to be fully involved in a local church, whether that is near their university or at home. So we're finding them coming in. And then we're also finding some of them come from situations where the family have been quite church itinerant. Or maybe they come from a particularly large church where there hasn't been that level of close discipleship, and we find that we're having more pastoral situations to deal with. Because if you're dealing with a bunch of students from 18 to 20, 21, there are particular challenges at that age that are only beginning maybe to surface, and we find ourselves, and our staff find ourselves having to deal with those pastoral issues. Now, I hope I'm not sounding too patronising towards this generation of students, because there are some amazing and incredibly gifted young people that we're working with.
Absolutely, yes.
But we do notice, if you like, potentially a fragility that is not their fault. That is just the reality of how society has developed over the past
Do you
decade.
find that COVID has affected the students?
Yes.
In what way?
Well, first of all, by preface to that, let me talk first of all in terms of our ministry, because sometimes I could look at the map of Europe and I could say these are the countries that were net beneficiaries of COVID. They coped with it well. They used the online stuff well. They kept up the one-to-one mentoring. They did really well. And I'm very happy to say that Ireland is one of those places. My successors in Christian Unions Ireland did a magnificent job, and actually I think the work has grown since then. I could also show you places where they would say we were net losers in COVID and almost had to restart all over again. So depending on the context, with the ministry, there were places that thrived, there were places that really struggled. And going down to the students themselves, I just feel, we can all remember how much of university life was about social interaction. If you asked me to give you my 10 biggest and most formative memories of university life, I'm not sure if any of them would contain something from the classroom or the lecture hall. I'm sorry to say,
nodding with you here.
I loved English. I loved English literature. I did well in it. I can remember some of the books I read. Great. But my most formative memories of university were social, in terms of friendships, in terms of things like the Christian Union, but also the football team and the choir and the dramatic society, and the people in my flat and the people in my hall of residence. And I'm thinking there was a generation of students that are just graduating around now for whom, they lost that. They actually lost that experience.
They did.
And therefore, this generation of students suffered it in their mid-high school years, maybe their GCSE years or whatever. But that also, I think, has still had an effect.
And there are issues, I'm imagining, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but of just how this generation of young people studying, learning, going out into the world, see themselves, because everything is so wrapped up in what you post and what comes up in social media and how others look at you and the impression that you are giving. Now, I'm in my late 50s and I post things thinking, I'll look really good if I do this before I catch myself on. But you know what I mean? How different would it have been when I'm 18, where that would have mattered much more to me? Or does it? I don't know.
It does. It does matter a huge amount, whichever platform happens to be trendy at the time. And some of them are really quite toxic. I think there's no doubt about that. The pressure, the pressure of the optics of how you look and what it means to have friends. Little things like, even when we're organising events, we are finding it very, very difficult. Sometimes, there's a couple of folks. We've used apps like Eventbrite where you can sign up online to go to something. If you don't charge, what you find is you will have about 300 or 400 people signing up in case nothing better comes up.
Yes.
And then suddenly you end up with 50 people at the event, because there is not that level of pre-commitment.
There's no buy-in. Yeah,
there's no buy-in. So how do you encourage that level of commitment? And I think part of it is down to that insecurity of, will I be missing out on something better if I do this? So one of the things I think we can offer are just some basic life skills. As you learn what it is to be a member of a group and to work together as a team. Some of the committees, the Christian Union committees, they will say, it's the first time we've really learned to work together as a team to put something on and to serve in the university. I think COVID has had an effect on that, and I'm not sure we'll know exactly how much until maybe another few years have gone by. But it robbed the student population of a lot.
Yes, I would agree with you there. Thinking about David Montgomery, the man, what takes someone who was a Presbyterian minister into student work?
Well, God's providences are something which will continue to amaze and confound us.
Well, you're also the foremost expert in European airports.
Yes, that's right. I should actually start.
I believe
thinking
you've been travelling lots
Well,
recently.
You've
You've
given
been
me an
bewildered
idea.
in all of them.
Yes, you've given me an idea there. I should start bringing a good camera, and I could produce a nice coffee table book someday. I'll tell you. I mean, yes. If it's Frankfurt or Warsaw, it's going to be more of a horror story than anything else. But I mean, calling. I've read a number of books about vocation and calling, and the ones that have made a big impact on me are those that really get back to first principles. You're calling to be a child of God. It's not in your profession. It's not in even your ministry. You know, to be a child of God and to be obedient to where He leads you. And there certainly was the case that for a bulk of my working life, that was in parish ministry. And I particularly enjoyed Bible teaching. I particularly enjoyed working with young adults and doing, and being involved in evangelism and, defending the Christian faith against other worldviews, etc. There were various moments along the journey where, it became clear that certain doors were closing for me. And about 10 years ago, I had served in a little church in the south of Ireland and I'd agreed to give them 5 years to see if it could be, grow, if it could be turned around, if they could develop their own. They had been sharing a ministry with another church for a while. And at the end of that period, I think in some respects it was mission accomplished as far as what I felt I could do under God. We had seen some encouragements and growth, and I think it was stable. But I wasn't 100% sure I was the right person to continue with that. And a little bit out of the blue, I got approached to see would I consider going back in to lead the student movement. Now, I had been very involved as a student. I'd been involved not just in my local group, but I'd represented Scotland, where I'd studied on the National Student Executive. So I'd been very involved for a few years as a student, and then in my time as a pastor or as a minister or even as a student for the ministry in Canada, where I went, I would always have spoken at student groups. And I always said to Gwen, you have to say yes and no to certain things. I would always do my utmost to say yes to the student groups because that's the ones I found stimulating. They'd always ask you to speak on some ridiculously difficult subject.
And clarify, Gwen's your wife.
Yes, Gwen's my wife, yes.
And I believe that she also has some very wonderful gifts that I would actually probably love to call upon.
Well, if you want to talk about decluttering, I'll be happy, and she'll be happy for me to do that, I'm sure, in a moment. Yeah, so I always said yes to student groups because I found them the most stimulating, and they asked me to do the most difficult things, and there was never any monetary award because I never had any money. So I would almost sometimes travel to the other end of the country just for the experience of being with students and interacting on these subjects. And I suppose that stayed with me. So when it came to me, would you think of coming back and working with the student movement? It wasn't as ridiculous a thing as perhaps it sounds on paper. That most people that I'm working with now work with the student movement, maybe even lead it for a while before they go into other ministry. And then there's a very few for whom it's their sort of career ministry. I'm a bit of an outlier in that I was in the other ministry and then I came back into student ministry. And so for 5 years I had the privilege of heading up the student movement in Ireland, and then I was asked if I would do it in Europe. And I suppose in some respects you also look at your life circumstances. I mean, there are a lot of people for whom the sort of life I live, getting lost in airports and that sort of thing, is just not possible. Gwen and I, we don't have children. Our 4 parents have passed away. We were quite young when that happened, relatively young. And so we have the freedom. She's self-employed as a declutterer, sortedbygwen.co.uk if you're looking.
Oh, I must look her up. And my husband will be saying, yes, do, please.
So she's self-employed, and she can actually then choose certain times to come with me, especially since a lot of the leaders in Eastern Europe are younger women. And in those countries, it's ironic, sort of paradoxical, because they're quite patriarchal cultures. But very often they will put the burden of leading the student movement on young women without necessarily giving them the support that they actually need. And very often women will take this because there aren't the same opportunities in churches for them. So it helps for me to have Gwen with me, that not only can she help mentor some of these younger women, but we can spend time with the families and see, because it's an unusual job. If you're the general secretary for a student national movement, your church doesn't always understand what your job is. You can't talk to your staff because you're their boss. Your peer group are spread over 40 countries in Europe. So in some respects, being able to go and spend time, and that's what I spent my first year doing, essentially, after COVID, realising I need to do a fact-finding visit of how the region is, how it is organisationally and structurally, how it is spiritually, how it is in terms of their vision. And so it's been great. Just sometimes we've been able. I mean, Europe's funny. My Latin American friends laugh at me because on one occasion I was able to do 3 countries in one day. I visited Benelux. And actually,
I thought you were about to say Australia. America.
No. That's 4 movements, because our Belgian movement has 2 different movements: French speaking and Flemish speaking. So I was able to do 4 movements in one day. But we were able to get through the region and to see what the needs were. And very often, it's hard to describe, because say we go to Slovenia on the Wednesday and we're there until the Friday. Wednesday night, we meet the staff, they have a meal for us and we talk to them, we get a flavour. Thursday we'll go round and the General Secretary will show me, introduce me to a couple of church leaders, we'll talk about the ministry, what their needs are, what the support is, I'll maybe speak at a student event, something like that there. It's not until the Friday that maybe they open up and talk about the real struggles that they're having. The first 2 days have been trying to prove to me that everything's going great here. Look at what we're doing, which is good. It is. But then we also need to sit and listen. How are you doing? And you can't do that on a Zoom call. On the Zoom call, they'll generally tell you everything's all right. So it's been time-consuming. It's had its own level of exhaustion, I suppose, but incredibly rewarding.
You're listening to the Commission Files. We're going to take a quick break.
She was the older sister living in poverty, but her brother lived in a palace for much of his life. She believed he would rescue her people from slavery, but she didn't know how. Then God spoke.
Moses, I am the God of your fathers. I have heard the cries of my people. I have come to rescue them and to lead them out of Egypt. Now go, you must lead my people Israel out of Egypt.
You can hear Miriam and many other Bible drama stories online at Commission's website at commissionradio.org/programs.
Welcome back to the Commission Files with Kerry Gregg and Will Leach. Our guest is David J. Montgomery, Monty to everyone else. And it's the David J. that made me think of what I saw on the front of a book recently. The new book, The Unfinished Story, 30 Days in Luke and Acts. I presume the publishers just wouldn't let you put Monty on the front.
No, they wouldn't. I'm not a prolific author. My previous book was published 23 years ago. And I remember
This isn't a sequel.
This is not a sequel, no. I remember at that time, the publisher at that time put on David J. Montgomery, I think because there was another David Montgomery around who'd just written something. So I decided to stick with that for this one. The book 23 years ago was in church worship and music. So it's a bit of a gear change. But during COVID, I had this idea. A lot of folks had been asking me about devotional material. There seemed to be a bit of a gap for something that was a little deeper than just a 2 or 3 minute read, but not so intimidating that folks would never sit down and read it. I remember as a student, Search the Scriptures was a big thing that we did. Took you through the whole Bible. Remember, I think it used to be, my copy was blue, I think. But
I have it somewhere.
It just asked questions. It was good. It took you through every book of the Bible in a year, but it just asked questions. That was good. It was good for inductive and serious study. But for those who actually want some guidance or whatever, I mean, there's well-known theological authors like Don Carson who write very, very densely in his, For the Love of God books, etc. I was trying to catch something in between that. something that is more than just the odd question, but would help people get into the whole text of what Luke was trying to do in those two books. So during COVID, I actually started with an ambitious project of a year-long one that would cover every book of the Bible in some way. And then IFES got in touch with me because I'd actually asked them, do you think there'd be a market for this? They said, well, we need to celebrate our 75th anniversary with some sort of book. And after various iterations, we settled on Luke Acts. And I like that because what was happening in Acts and the pioneering of the early church is not dissimilar to what some of our movements are doing in what we would call virgin territory in their universities. It's a devotional on a selected part that takes you from the beginning of Luke to the end of Acts. There's a section that says the wider story if you want to read the in-between bits before tomorrow's. And there is a prayer that half of them, my wife wrote half of them, and then members, my colleagues from around the world, so the regional secretaries of all the other regions contributed a prayer. And then there's a psalm, what we call a psalm at bedtime or an evening psalm, which is linked to the morning reading. If anyone's thinking of being an author, let me tell you, the fun bit is writing it and getting it done. The months after that, getting it from written to actually is a nightmare, no matter how good your publisher is. At the end, you just want to say, get it, I don't care, get it out there.
And then there's all the talk shows like this.
That's right. Yes, that's right. There's all the launches and talk shows. Thanks,
Heaven
guys.
help you.
Yes. Yeah, this is the fun bit. So yes, it's not just for students. And even if you have no experience of IFEs or what it is, they're stories of ordinary people, and they're not. It's not every day has one. There's probably about 20 of them in the book. So it's spread out. And I think too. I mean, there's folks who aren't believers who might be interested in picking it up because, of course, Luke was a historian. Luke was a medic. He was writing for the skeptics. He was, he said in his introduction to both volumes to Theophilus, who he was writing to, that it was his aim to give an accurate picture both of what Jesus started to do and teach in Luke's Gospel in his earthly ministry and what he continued to do and teach in the Acts of the Apostles. So it was actually written for a skeptical audience. And I hope just even from the stories that I selected from Luke's Gospel, you get something of the character and person of Jesus coming through in a fresh way.
Thinking about the students, more and more we see that the traditional church is a challenge because of the diverseness that has grown in our world. What would you say to the students that come to you and say, I can't find a church, or I don't know what church to belong to? I know that you did your thesis in biovocational church. If you'd maybe like to explain that, could you ever find yourself using that?
It's interesting. I was asked to speak about it not that long ago. I wrote the thesis 10 years ago, and I also find it really useful in my current ministry because some of the principles about church planting can be transferred to planting para-church student groups. And a lot of ours all over Europe, the big issue is finances and funding. We don't have enough funding for staff. And the reason I wrote my thesis on bivocational church planting was that I felt that the need was so great, particularly in the south of Ireland where I was at the time, that if we only had one model of church leadership, which was fully paid, pastor with all the things that go with that, then we'll never plant the number of churches that need to be planted to reach the population of the island. And so we need to look at new models. And similarly in student ministry, I'm saying, let's look. For example, our leader, our general secretary in Croatia is a businessman. So he's bivocational. Our general secretary in Greece runs a car hire business. So he's bivocational. Mm-hmm. Even though they feel that their real passion is their ministry, they've decided the only way I can do this is by working alongside that. In terms of students and wanting to find churches, etc., there's nothing new under the sun. It maybe just a little bit different. When I was 19 or 20, I was frustrated with a lot of the traditional church at that time. And now I guess there is a generation of students who's quite frustrated with the churches that we have planted and changed and formed. And there is something just generational there. What I was constantly come back to is to say, as part of our discipleship of our students, you cannot do it on your own. You know, sitting at home, listening to even very good podcasts like this, or YouTube channels or streams, won't cut it. You need the challenge and the cut and thrust of Christians supporting one another, encouraging one another, praying for one another, getting on one another's nerves. All of that is part of discipleship. There's a reason that the New Testament was essentially written to churches or to church leaders. It is a challenge. I mean, it's not a problem that I'm not unsympathetic to it, because in other parts of Europe, I'm maybe more unsympathetic here in Ireland because I think a lot of us don't know that we're living in regard to that. But in parts of Eastern Europe particularly, I have found that a lot of our graduates have struggled because what they say to us is that in the student movement, in the IFES movement, I gained three things that were just formative for me. I learned to have fellowship with students from different Christian traditions that weren't just part of my tradition. I saw a richness there. I got a depth of teaching about how the gospel impacts all of life and my studies, and deep Bible teaching that I didn't get in the churches. And I got an evangelistic or a missionary vision for how God wants us to reach our nation. In many of these cases, they're going back into situations where the churches are small, churches are very traditional, and perhaps even in some cases the pastors are threatened by these young graduates coming out and wanting to help because they would feel threatened by that. And so we have looked and we have thought about, are there ways in which we can develop our graduates, encouraging them perhaps towards church planting, so that if somebody is graduating from a church in Serbia or in Hungary or whatever, we can say, well, there is an IFES graduate who is now leading a church and you will get those same values there. And so I think we do serve the wider church with a small c by providing good leaders and helping them to take some of the values they've learned from us into their church and help to reform and to revitalise and to revive the church. As culture changes, the expectations of each new generation will be such that the church needs to reflect that culture. Mm-hmm. That's always a balance that we've had to find, isn't it? That we take the cultural realities perhaps in ways of how we do music, how we teach, how we preach, how we form ourselves into groups, and we recognise those cultural realities, but we don't sell out to the cultural values at the same time.
What would you see as your vision going forward?
I'm not too different in age from your co-host here. So I'm sort of looking, he was privileged to be in a job that allowed him to get out earlier than I think I can get out. But I would hope that I would maybe have another 6 or 7 years. And therefore it is important for me to say, well, how can I serve this generation of leaders while laying the foundations that what we do is sustainable? And therefore I'm looking at, well, who will take over for me after this? But in the meantime, my vision is that we have 44 student movements, and the only two places where we don't have at the moment is Malta, where we did once, but and that will be restarted, God willing, at the end of next year. But we've never had anything in Kosovo. And I visited there just 2 months ago, and I'm delighted to say that after a fair amount of prayer, but unexpectedly quickly, we have a young woman backed by 3 pastors who will start a student ministry in Kosovo, and she's ready to go. And we've got her orientation sorted out and making sure that she's got all that she needs, and that's exciting. Mm-hmm. So we are now everywhere we could be. So how do we then build that qualitatively so that there is a sustainable movement and that we are able to help them chart whatever bumps in the road they come across? because there's always 3 or 4 crises happening. Tragically, one of our leaders died 2 years ago unexpectedly. There's often conflict between board and staff, just the usual governance stuff. Sometimes the culture comes in heavy, so whether that is an atheistic culture or a particularly traditionalistic Orthodox or Catholic culture, or even in Scandinavia, we haven't always had the support of the majority church there. They feel threatened by parachurch. So we always have these things to navigate. But my vision is that in the next 6 or 7 years, that all of our movements will know what it is to be gospel-hearted and have a vision to reach our students, and that they'll be prepared to make the sacrifices that will be necessary to do that.
Monty there. David Montgomery, the Regional Secretary for Europe with IFES.
Thanks, Monty, for coming in. He did know the way, Kerry. He'd been here before. He'd even bought a tow bar next door.
Yes, loads of people have, from what I've been hearing.
What a lot of trailers and caravans people seem to have. Anyway, a bustling business next door. That's it from the Commission Files this time. Thanks so much for listening. We're made at the studios of Commission Christian Radio in Dundonald. You can check us out at commissionradio.org.
Do spread the word about the podcast, encourage others to listen and follow us, and don't forget our sister podcast, Inspired to Act from Thrive Ireland. More details about that at thriveIreland.org.
And we'll both see you soon. Bye.
Bye.